History shapes everything we do and everything we believe. Across the centuries, a few have written the stories of humanity, and in doing so, have silenced countless others. Choke Points Through Time is where those voices are heard again. Discover the truths history tried to hide and the forces that still shape our world today. Choke Points Through Time, a journey through the pivotal moments of mankind's story. And now, here is Dr. Wayne Sedlak.
Hello again. I'd like to welcome you to yet another edition of Choke Points Through Time. There is a choke point that needs to be readdressed. In fact, it's beginning to be addressed throughout the internet. Years ago, when I began ministry back in the 1970s and 80s, this issue of America's Christian heritage was debated in the churches, and I find that many men who took a stand for America's Christian heritage were in fact pretty well beaten up inside their denominations. They were attacked, they were maligned, they were pressured to knock it off, to stop this. And in fact, the denominations very much, and the seminaries, very much got into the fray, heavily slanted against making the point that America had a Christian heritage, that America was in fact birthed as a Christian nation. We're going to examine that latter point in the not-too-distant future, because right now, between now and, July 4th, that whole era, I'm going to combine our Insights series here on Choke Points with this very issue. I think you'll be shocked, pleasantly surprised, at how much of our history was so thoroughly Christianized. And I'm going to add to it. Yes, I've announced time and again that we have an economics course coming up in September. I'm going to combine that for a good reason. We're dealing with Christianity as it affected our forefathers, particularly after the Great Awakening, but also America's economic heritage. Obviously, America became a great economic power. Everybody knows that. No historian in his salt worth his salt would deny that America's heritage, economic heritage, began way back in our colonial period. But what they do deny, they tend to separate it from Christianity, or they show that Christianity had kind of a tangential effect. Not at all. It was the major driving force that made America a great economic power. Now, you might use the word capitalist, and I'm going to also, but perhaps you and I will not be in agreement as to what that term means. See, I'm going to hail back to the word capitalist when it was invented by socialists, used by so many to describe, well, frankly, the use of capital goods, the draw upon capital goods, meaning machinery, that kind of thing, in order to be much more productive. That very thought is under attack in America by the environmentalist movement. However, I'm combining the economics and the genius therein of America's heritage directly with the impact of the church and Christianity. You see, should give us all pause and hope. Because you see, when you have tyrants, when you have the rise of tyranny and corrupt officials, there's a great lesson to be learned here. Now, again, I'm going to tell you that we have our economics course, and some of what you hear here, you'll get all year when you understand the science of money and sound economy. Like I said, I'm going to add to that the Christian emphasis. In a moment, I'll show you how that's done. In fact, we're not forcing some splice here. We are actually testifying to a wisdom that God promises in His Word. Remember, America won the war war for independence, without a navy, without an army. There were militias. There was no Continental Army until later. And that Continental Army was not yet disciplined. It took two winters at Valley Forge to bring about the discipline that George Washington needed to face the professionals, the British. There was no budget. Well, yeah, there was a budget in Continental dollars. The Continental dollars were worthless. Getting resources. You see, we were up against every imaginable problem. We had but one great, proven general going into the war, and that was George Washington. He was proven from the French and Indian War. The rest, well, we just didn't have the leadership. We didn't have a professional corps of trained officers. So we didn't have the veterans. Some from Indian fighting, some from the French and Indian War. By and large, we did not have that kind of training under our belt. How did we win the war? You're about to see. One other announcement. In the first half of July, and corresponding to this same theme, I'm writing a mini book. It'll have a lot of proofs in it. It'll be, 50, 60, maybe 70 pages total. But it's going to show you the major branches, the major impact. We just can't get all the proofs in there. But I'm going to show you what the major arguments are. The fact that America was a Christian, had a Christian foundation. And there will be enough in there to show you the economic wisdom that God gave. Now, again, I'm bringing the two in. That's a mini book that should be out no later than mid-July. So I'll, in fact, give it a pre-pub special here. If you want that, write us a note, go to Vision Viewpoint, let us know by way of email. It should be ready then. The price is going to be about, well, it's going to be under $20. Normally, the mini books would be going for more than that because each one is a specialty. But in this case, no, it's going to be under 20. So you'll have that available to you. So let's get on with what I've promised you. Max Weber demonstrated that where Christianity goes, where Christianity with its people being taught the word of the Lord, not a Christianity where people are told what to believe, but rather a Christianity that calls the people to use their Bibles. They become knowledgeable therein, for its wisdoms. That kind of Christianity, wherever it goes, like in America's Great Awakening, right there in that 1700s. In fact, the lead up to the War for Independence, wherever that kind of impact goes to the masses, regions, whole colonies, where people cry unto the Lord and are converted. Preaching of George Whitfield, Jonathan Edwards, Gilbert and William Tennant, Sam Davies. Earlier than that was Theodore Frelinghuysen and John Witherspoon and many others, called the Black Regiment. Now, what I want to do is show how he spliced, well, there's no force feed here, how America's colonial Christianity, its churches, became a study for Max Weber later on, and the influence of the pulpits in moving people to conversion in Christ. But in doing so, a transformation of the soul takes place such that the people learn not to conquer their neighbor. Rather, they learn to love and serve their neighbor. That agape love services the community in a variety of different ways. Obviously, the love you have for your wife is different from the love you have for a Christian brother, the love you have for your neighbor. But they are all motivated by agape, different kind of service, different kind of applications. The pulpits move people from a conquer thy neighbor to a service and love for your neighbor. You and I both know the proof text. of loving your neighbor as yourself. We find those all throughout the New Testament, quoting, by the way, the Old Testament. Jesus even said that loving your God and loving your neighbor brings to maturity the law of God, the Pentateuch, Moses, as well as the prophets. So what happened during our war for independence that could bring that kind of a powerful testimony? You see, American privateers are what really won the war for independence. I'd like to say it was our abilities in the battlefield, and taking nothing away from George Washington, who did a spectacular job as commander of the forces, Continental Army, later as our first president. It was what happened economically in the high seas that broke the British. Now, you see, American privateers, America had no navy, but the Continental Congress could issue documents, letters of marque and reprisal. They issued documents to sea captains that would motivate the sea captains to convert their fishing ships, which we had, there were hundreds of those up and down the seacoast, and outfit them for war. And what they did was they went out and they preyed upon, not the big British warships. They went out around the British Isles, and they began destroying merchant ships, headed with resources, headed with food, to the British Isles, to the British people. It would be impossible, we knew, to build a navy to counteract the great British Navy presence. We didn't even try. But what we did was they exercised enormous pressure, economic pressure, on Great Britain. During the siege of Boston, for example, right there at the beginning, 1775, George Washington leased private ships and manned them with uniformed seamen. The Continental Congress, as I said, furthered this strategy in March of 1776. It worked so well, allowing private citizens, quote, to fit out armed vessels to cruise on the enemies of these united colonies. There's a powerful testimony to the seagoing actions of private individuals. Sometimes small groups of them will go out together. Other times, they would just act individually. The British were so enraged because prices were going up. Food was becoming harder to get. The consumers in Great Britain were pushed to feed their families. The outcry was against King and Parliament. The seed of financial incentive given by the Continental Congress, mixed with patriotic obligations, awakened the independent spirit of capitalism, says Robert Patton, author of The Patriot Pirates, The Privateer War. You see, patriotism and capitalism merged, and these privateers went to war, but they were able then to garnish for themselves much of the loot from the British merchant ships. Remember, this was war. And I say, well, all of a sudden these two are spliced together. No, you see, capitalism had already become the major economic influence in the colonies. You say, well, capitalism, is that good? Let's answer that as a yes, no, depending upon what you are defining capitalism to be. Max Weber pointed out that in his Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism, capitalism exists in all economies, socialist, communist, corporate economies. It exists in prostitutes. It exists in government rulers. It exists, in a good way, in business people. Capitalism abounds. The British were involved in capitalism, and they shut down Boston Port to starve out the people of Boston. And the privateers were engaging in capitalism when they were attacking the British merchants, and they were starving Great Britain. As Weber noted, there are two major kinds of capitalism. First of all, what is capitalism? Capitalism means you're taking Well, capital, money, or money substitutes, money commodities like, well, today, stocks and bonds and things like that. And you're investing them in tools, dyes, equipments, ship during war, not just ships, but cannon, ammunition, large items, tractor-type things. We're going to become more productive in the use. You can have a greater impact through the massive amount of productive capacity, say of a ship or of a tractor. Well, America had already learned that. See, Weber pointed out that during our colonial experience, it was the pulpits drawing heavily from the economic principles found all throughout the Bible that taught a serious-minded Christianity, honest gain. See, as a Christian, I'm disallowed by God from engaging in conquering my neighbor. By conquest, I mean, again, you've heard me define it, I'll say it again, using deceit, cheating in some manner, lying, the grosser forms, rape, robbery, war. When you do that, you're hurting your neighbor to get gain. You're conquering your neighbor. The Christian doesn't do that. Now, he has to balance and watch his costs, but he's allowed to take the risk necessary and make a profit for that risk. But in doing so, he can't just do anything he wants. He works hard to be just and upright, to produce something that is an honest good. It is what it purports to be. Well, you see, that kind of capitalism is different from the first, which conquers. Socialism has been called monopolistic capitalism because the socialists are trying to make money off you, crushing the populace with all sorts of regulation and costs and name it. It's still conquest. And all the resources are going upward as a monopoly of the state. Eventually, the people either throw that away or they're broken and become slaves. America charged Britain with that very thing. Many pamphlets writing against Britain's economic attacks upon the United States, the colonies, the Townshend Acts, the Intolerable Acts, the Declaratory Act, the Stamp Tax. This was economic warfare. And as one pamphlet said, soon we will be nothing more, quoting now the Bible, be nothing more than hewers of wood and drawers of water for Great Britain. And they resisted it. That's why they threw all the tea in Boston Harbor. They didn't hurt anybody. They didn't damage anything except a broken lock to a strong box, and they replaced that lock. You see, Britain was engaged in economic warfare, capitalism, as a conquer thy neighbor strategy. In the war for independence, we either were going to be conquered by them or we'd have to fight back. The privateers, many of them, were Christian men. Many. Well, the annals of the United States federal government tells us that there were, what was it? Something like 1,400 boats that went out of New England alone. A vast majority of them claiming to be led by Christian men, Christian captains. New England was the heartbeat of Puritanism, and it was the heartbeat of liberty, and it was the heartbeat of economic innovation. So the British called them privateers or pirates. In fact, the British were so angry that they, even though this was an act of war, they declared that the pirates, these privateer Americans, were not to be considered soldiers or sailors. They were to be considered pirates and therefore would not be put on trial. They'd simply be kept incarcerated. There were many who were. In fact, the British built prison ships. Those prison ships, they housed many of the sailors and captains they captured The British enacted that Pirate Act of 1777. And it did two things. Because it was so outrageous, and because Great Britain declared that Americans were not worthy of jury trials or even of a trial, word got around Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Britain itself. You know, if they can do it to them, what about our English Bill of Rights? The King and Parliament can do it to us. In fact, King and Parliament had done that at different times in the not-so-distant past. So now there's cleavage between the populace and protests throughout Britain, in London, and elsewhere, against the war, against the Privateer Act, against this cessation of liberty, this denial of the English Bill of Rights, against what was being done on these British prison ships to American sailors and captains. Just want to take a moment, show you how God is so consistent when it comes to Reformation. I'll take you back 200 years. During the Dutch War of Independence against the Spanish tyrants, there were people called the sea beggars. Well, many of those sea beggars were, well, they're the same thing as the Americans later. Fishermen who converted their boats to spring forays inland upon down rivers, and there's a lot of river action in the Netherlands. They go down river, they hit the Spanish, and then leave. You see, the Dutch couldn't win on the land from 1566 to 1571, but the sea beggars were winning. They're hunting down everything Spanish on the sea and on the land. Surprising, like the Vikings of old, they'd come out of the mists of the Atlantic, they'd hit their enemy and go back to sea. They'd plunder a Spanish depot or a Spanish outlet. They'd ransack a Spanish fort. They'd hit a logistics cargo ship. They ransack it, burn it in harbor, and then take off. Now think of this for a moment. So, well, that's just a bunch of pirates. William of Orange, the great Christian leader of the Netherlands, called for that action. Not only did he call for it, he called for what they called the presbyteries or consistories of the Dutch to exercise a networking effect of churches, secret churches throughout the Netherlands. The first Synod of Emden in 1571 began that movement of networking. That would be the turning point in the war. But the famous Synod of North Holland of July 1572 called for chaplains, as did the Synod of Middelburg, the first Synod of Middelburg, 1581, for chaplains on board these rough-and-tumble sea-beggar ships. And you know what? The chaplains were respected. Now, these weren't frail and pale men preaching. These chaplains were men of substance, meaning men of character. Their preaching was compelling. That doesn't mean that everybody on board the ship became a Christian. No, not at all. But many did, and many already were. And the word of God spread throughout the sea beggars. Finally, as William of Orange could coordinate land and sea forces, the Spanish, the most powerful army in Europe of the day, were driven back, constantly beaten and bloodied. The same kind of thing happened in America. For the same reasons. The Dutch preachers had united sound economy. You can't go out and conquer your neighbor as a function of making profit. You can defend your nation. That's different, especially since the atrocities of the Spanish were overwhelmingly cruel. They had savage homes, strip women in inquisitions, torture them while naked. You can guess where and how. And the men got fed up with it. Inquisitor generals like Peter Tielemans became notorious in the Netherlands. The men finally had it. It's like God grew headship in the homes all of a sudden. Same thing happened in America. You see, the capitalism coupled with patriotism, like the reference I gave you from Robert Preston, combined a wisdom born of Christianity, nurtured by patriotism and necessity. And the British Navy, the British military machine, collapsed in the face of this kind of pressure. So what happened? British merchants were losing a lot of money. The consumers in Britain were staging protests against the king and against Parliament. The privateers were overwhelmingly successful in breaking them economically. I haven't even begun to describe how economics was used on land. You see, our forces on land were no match for Great Britain or their Hessian allies, their German mercenaries. And yet, sound economy, coupled with patriotism and the Christian faith, and the wisdom that nurtured both and spliced them together, was a major factor in defeating Great Britain. One last bit of, shall we say, wisdom from Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was an ambassador in Europe, and he granted letters of marque and reprisal to a number of ships there from France to hunt down British shipping. The French allowed that. And that caused, and this was his design, we know from his letters, he was hoping not just for more privateers to go to war on the seas around Great Britain. What he was hoping for was Britain and France colliding diplomatically, ultimately bringing France into the war on our side, which is exactly what occurred. Yes, the Battle of Saratoga that we won that battle in, 1778. And Europe was shocked by it. The Parliament was awed. When the news came to Parliament, they were silent. Granted, but Saratoga is often overrated because, you see, as far as its impact in getting France and other allies into the war on our side, you see, history supports, archived documents support the fact that battle at Saratoga, as important as it was dwarfed by the economic impact of those privateers. And now the diplomatic stress between Britain and France, and then the aid that came from France because of its reaction to the British pressure diplomatically, till finally the two broke out in war, and France came in on our side. Benjamin Franklin had used economic wisdom to help humble Great Britain. Like I said, we haven't even begun to describe the economics in the war for independence. We certainly have not exhausted either the privateer war. It's an enormous subject. Alfred Mahan's famous book on the role of sea power, the influence of sea power in world history, took its cue from these kinds of adventures. More often than not, Mahan, writing about sea power, wrote about the economic consequences. We're going to continue to show the powerful influence of Christianity in the formation of our country. We're going to take it backwards a while, and then we're going to go forward then. We were birthed a Christian nation, and wise counsels flowed first from the pulpits and then to our countrymen, creating a whole new set of leaders. America could claim that God's providence favored her. I would again direct your attention to the economics course in September. I would certainly appreciate it if you would like us or share us with your friends and others. You see, if people don't have to simply sit back and wait for the debt crisis to explode all over us, for corruption to eat us alive. We don't have to wait. There's much that we can learn and what we can do in the face of what appears to be overwhelming odds. May God bless you.
This has been Choke Points Through Time with Dr. Wayne Sedlak. Visit us at visionviewpoint.com, where you'll find a host of articles, books, and videos designed to answer any questions you may have. Join us Tuesdays and Fridays for Choke Points Through Time with Dr. Wayne Sedlak.